America just tore the legal tarp off nearly 1,100 Somali nationals, protection held since 1991. Then a federal judge stepped aside and let the government finish the job. Temporary protected status was never meant to be permanent, a tarp thrown over a leaking roof, covering people fleeing Somalia's civil war until conditions improved. In 2025, Washington moved to tear it down. A judge blocked that termination, until the Supreme Court restricted how far courts can question TPS decisions, and the block came off. So who decides when someone's storm is over? Right now, that call belongs to Washington. Here's what it costs. Nearly 1,100 Somali nationals carry temporary protected status today. Small enough for Washington to treat as a rounding error, large enough to wipe out entire families in one announcement. Each person built a life around a designation nobody expected to last 3 decades. An apartment lease, a car payment, a job renewed through a federal verification system. The administration announced the termination in 2025, setting a hard date when protection simply stops. Not fades, not phases out. Stops. Losing that status is not a technicality, and it is not gradual. It ends deportation protection outright, turning someone lawfully present into someone the government can detain and remove. The same day it ends the legal right to work. Permit and deportation shields stapled to the same paper, issued together, expiring together. A grocery clerk in Minneapolis, a nurse's aide in Columbus, a warehouse worker in Seattle all wake up newly deportable and newly unemployable, with nothing in between. The tarp doesn't come down gradually. It comes down all at once. That in-between space is exactly what temporary protected status was built to hold. Congress created it in the Immigration Act of 1990, a narrow fix for people already inside the United States when war, disaster, or collapse made their home country too dangerous to return to. Senator Ted Kennedy sponsored the provision, and it took effect on January 1st, 1991, just as Somalia's government was collapsing an ocean away. Before 1990, the government handled these cases piecemeal, one fix at a time, with no consistent rule. TPS replaced that patchwork with a single mechanism. The Secretary of Homeland Security decides which countries qualify, reviews it on a set schedule, and either redesignates or lets the clock run out. What TPS grants is specific and limited. Permission to work legally, with a card that satisfies any employer's verification system. It grants deferred removal, meaning the government formally agrees not to deport you while the designation stands. It never grants a green card or a path to citizenship. Congress built it as a waiting room, not a destination. Every person holding it always knew the floor could give way the moment Washington decided the danger had passed. Somalia was never the only country standing on that floor. Over the decades, TPS has covered people from El Salvador, Haiti, Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, and over a dozen other countries hit by war, earthquake, or collapse, all under the same rule: work, renew, hope the danger hasn't passed. El Salvador's designation followed 2 earthquakes in 2001. Haiti's followed the 2010 quake that killed over 200,000. Ukraine's began in April 2022. What made Somalia different was duration. No other country on that list held the status as long as Somalia, 3.5 decades and counting before 2025, making Somalia the test case for how far temporary could stretch before Washington held it to its literal meaning. Holding a word to its literal meaning is also where the program's oldest criticism comes from. Critics on the right say frequent renewal starts to look like permanent residency by another name, granted without the vetting of the actual green card process. Defenders counter that renewals were never automatic. Each required the country to still be unsafe, and Somalia kept re-qualifying because Somalia kept being unsafe, not because anyone stopped checking. That argument, renewal proving real danger or proving the program lost its brakes, is now playing out over nearly 1,100 people. Nowhere does that argument land harder than Somalia, where the clock started 34 years ago. The United States designated Somalia for TPS in 1991, the year Mogadishu's government stopped existing. Siad Barre's regime collapsed, warlords carved up the capital, and the country fell into clan warfare with no functioning state. The famine that followed killed hundreds of thousands, a catastrophe the world watched and failed to stop. Relief agencies later estimated the 1992 famine alone killed roughly 250,000 people, half of them children under 5, in a country of about 7 million. Washington judged that sending anyone back into that vacuum was a death sentence and granted protection to Somalis already here. The designation was meant to be temporary, a bridge until Somalia found its footing. Instead, the bridge kept extending. Somalia qualified for renewal after renewal through repeated famines, the rise of al-Shabaab in the mid-2000s, and an insurgency that seized territory and imposed its own courts. Al-Shabaab formed in 2006 and by 2011 controlled most of southern Somalia, including the port city of Kismayo. 3 decades of redesignations turned a temporary measure into a fixture of Somali American life, not an exception. An entire generation grew up under a status renewed every 18 months, married, had children, buried parents, built careers around paper that renewed every time until it didn't. It didn't, because in 2025, the administration decided the TARP had done its job. Secretary Kristi Noem signed the termination notice, published in the Federal Register on June 13, 2025, setting a 60-day countdown before Somalia's designation would lapse. The Department of Homeland Security pointed to specific changes on the ground. Security gains in parts of the country. Urban centers that function day to day with markets and schools instead of checkpoints and factional gunfire, and an internationally recognized federal government still sitting in Mogadishu, still running ministries, still holding elections, however imperfect. That government has held on for years with the backing of an African Union peacekeeping force and has now survived longer than the one it replaced. DHS treated that survival, propped up or not, as the headline fact. Somalia in 2025, the agency argued, is not Somalia in 1991. There is a state to return to, even if imperfect and unevenly in control. DHS set a termination date after which the roughly 1,100 Somali TPS holders would no longer be covered, framing the move as simple accounting rather than cruelty. The emergency that justified the TARP in 1991 is not the emergency Somalia lives with today, and a temporary status that never ends stops being temporary at all. That accounting is exactly what the people about to lose their status refused to accept, and they took the fight to court. Somali TPS holders and their attorneys argued the government was reading a press release instead of a map. The lawsuit, filed in federal court in San Francisco, sought to block the termination nationwide on behalf of 11 individual plaintiffs. Al-Shabaab, an armed group linked to al-Qaeda and one of the most durable insurgencies in Africa, still contests significant stretches of Somali territory, taxing villages under threat of violence, planting roadside bombs on roads government forces are supposed to control, and holding rural ground the federal government cannot reach without a foreign military escort. Drought cycles keep triggering famine warnings across the south. The same catastrophe that first pushed people out of Somalia in the early 1990s and still displaces tens of thousands every time the rains fail. Their argument was not that nothing in Somalia has changed, but that nothing has changed enough. A functioning ministry in Mogadishu does not translate into safety in Lower Shabelle or Bay region, and ending protection now means sending people back into exactly the danger the designation was written to prevent. A federal judge heard that argument, and for a while, it won. The court blocked the termination from taking effect, freezing the administration's timeline before a single work permit could expire. The injunction, issued in September 2025, gave the roughly 1,100 status holders at least another year of protection while litigation continued. For the roughly 1,100 people caught in the middle, that order meant the TARP stayed nailed down while the fight played out in a courtroom instead of their front yards. Renewals kept processing. Work permits kept arriving in the mail. The end date the administration had set was suspended, not canceled. A pause built on one premise: that a federal court still had authority to weigh the government's stated reasons for ending TPS. For months, that premise was the only thing standing between roughly 1,100 people and removal proceedings. That limbo had a particular texture. People kept renewing leases they weren't sure they'd finish paying off. Employers kept staff on payroll under permits, stamped with expiration dates nobody trusted anymore. It was protection, technically, but protection with an asterisk, the kind that makes a person keep a folder of documents by the front door just in case. That asterisk is what the Supreme Court erased next, not by ruling on how dangerous Somalia actually is, but by ruling on how much any judge is even allowed to ask. How much any judge is allowed to ask is exactly the question the Supreme Court answered next, and it didn't even happen in a Somalia case. Ruling on a TPS fight over a different country entirely, the court sharply narrowed how much any federal judge may question a TPS termination once the Secretary of Homeland Security has made the call. The court's reasoning treated the termination as the kind of foreign policy adjacent judgment courts are built to defer to, not second guess. The decision wasn't about Somalia specifically. The justices weren't weighing a single fact about Mogadishu or al-Shabaab. But it didn't need to be about Somalia to change Somalia's case. It set binding precedent for every TPS termination in the federal court system, curtailing judges' power to dig into the executive branch's read of conditions on the ground wherever that read gets challenged. Somalia's case was still open, still sitting in front of the same judge who had already blocked the termination once. That judge was now bound by a rule written to resolve someone else's fight. Bound by that rule, the judge did the only thing the new precedent left available, lifted the injunction that had kept Somalia's Tarp in place. The order was explicit about why. The Supreme Court's restriction on judicial review of TPS decisions left the court without room to keep blocking the administration's determination, regardless of what the judge personally thought about the facts on the ground in Somalia. The reasoning wasn't buried in a footnote. It was the entire basis for the ruling, cited directly as the reason the injunction could no longer stand. With that, the government was cleared to move forward on ending Somalia's TPS designation. The TARP wasn't torn down by a change of heart in the courtroom. It was torn down because the one authority holding it in place got overruled by a higher court answering a completely different question. And the judge said as much on the record. For the families watching that order arrive, the reversal must have landed strangely. This was not a new judge substituting harshness for compassion. It was the same judge, the same courtroom, reading facts about Somalia that hadn't moved an inch, and concluding the law no longer let those facts matter. That is a colder kind of loss than losing on the merits. It is losing on jurisdiction, on who gets to ask the question at all, while the actual danger back home goes unexamined by anyone wearing a robe. Nothing about Mogadishu changed between the order that blocked the termination and the order that lifted it. Only the rulebook changed in a courthouse thousands of miles away, deciding a case about a country that was not Somalia. A ruling about someone else's case still landed on nearly 1,100 people, right here, immediately. Once the status lapses, employment authorization lapses with it, on paper, immediately, with no grace period. Every one of those workers becomes subject to the same enforcement machinery as anyone else without lawful status. Removal proceedings, possible detention, the full weight of standard immigration law where a protected category used to stand between them and it. Some will get a notice to appear in immigration court, joining a backlog that already stretches years deep. As of mid-2025, more than 3.7 million cases sat pending in immigration courts nationwide. Some will simply lose the paperwork that let them drive to work legally. Often the first domino that knocks over a job, then a lease, then everything built on both. Many of these are not recent arrivals chasing a fresh claim. Many have lived and worked in the United States for decades, renewing the same status their parents first received in the 1990s, raising children who have never set foot in Somalia and speak more English than Somali. The termination doesn't ask how long someone has been here, how many tax returns they've filed, or how many citizen children are asleep upstairs. It only asks whether the designation still holds. Now it doesn't, and everything downstream of that one fact starts moving. Strip away the legal maneuvering behind that fact, and the administration's case comes down to one plain sentence. This isn't 1991 anymore, so the tarp should come off. 3 decades is the load-bearing fact in that argument, repeated in filing after filing. A country doesn't stay frozen in the year. A designation was written, and Somalia's government has made real, documented gains against al-Shabaab in several regions, pushing the group out of towns it once controlled and holding that ground since. The African Union force that once did most of the fighting has begun handing districts back to Somali national troops. A drawdown, the administration reads, as evidence the state can finally stand on its own legs. That force, ANIS, drew down from about 19,000 troops in 2022 to under 12,000 by 2025. A federal government exists, functions, collects revenue, and answers to something resembling normal governance, which by itself is more institutional stability than Somalia had for most of the 1990s, when there was no government to speak of. To the administration, that comparison is not spin. It is the entire point of TPS being temporary. A status designed to expire when the emergency ends has to actually expire sometime, or the word temporary stops meaning anything. The people fighting this termination say Washington is reading the wrong chapter entirely. Al-Shabaab has not retreated from the story, it just got written out of. It keeps launching attacks in and around Mogadishu itself. The capital, the administration points to as proof of stability, including strikes on government offices, hotels, and military checkpoints inside the city the government supposedly controls. The State Department still keeps Somalia at its highest level travel advisory, Level 4, do not travel. The same category reserved for active war zones and collapsed states, not a country quietly returning to normal. Humanitarian organizations are still tracking mass displacement inside Somalia and warning of famine risk in the same southern regions where the danger first began in 1991, with hundreds of thousands living in makeshift camps because their villages are still unsafe. The UN's migration agency counted roughly 3.8 million internally displaced people nationwide in 2025, and a March bombing near a Mogadishu hotel killed at least a dozen people. To the challengers, a government that exists on paper in Mogadishu does not cancel out a war that never actually ended in the rest of the country. A functioning ministry and a live insurgency can both be true on the same day. Both of those truths land somewhere far more specific than a courtroom, a kitchen table, where a family decides whether to sell a car or empty a savings account for a lawyer. The legal fight over contested territory and travel advisory levels can feel abstract from the bench. It stops being abstract the moment the question becomes whether next month's rent gets paid by a paycheck that might not be legal to earn anymore, and whether the kids finish the school year in the only country most of them have ever known. Whether that storm has actually passed is still, technically, an open legal question, one that doesn't pay rent while it waits to be answered. The underlying dispute over Somalia's real conditions hasn't gone away just because the Injunction did, and it probably won't be resolved on any timeline that matters to the people it affects. Nearly 1,100 people lose their protection. While that argument continues in filings, most of them will never read. The termination moves forward regardless of whether the conflict in Somalia has actually cooled, because the fight was never really decided on the facts about Somalia at all. It was decided on who gets to weigh those facts in the first place. And thanks to the Supreme Court, that narrower question now reaches every TPS case in the country, not just this one. The Tarp came off Somalia first, but the rule that took it off doesn't know the word Somalia. He Tarp is gun. He storm sent. Whatever is happening on the ground in Mogadishu or Lower Shabelle, the legal cover that once separated nearly 1,100 people from deportation has been removed by a ruling that never examined Somalia's conditions at all. The administration got the outcome it wanted, on schedule. The courts, for now, are out of the argument. And the people left standing in the rain are the ones who spent 3 decades believing the Tarp was permanent enough to build a life under it. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. Should judges get to second-guess the government's read-on when a country is finally safe again? Or does that call always belong to whoever holds the White House? Tell me where you land in the comments. I read them. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around and subscribe.